That's public forum, so we move on. There are no apologies, but I will move for item 4, that the Council confirms the public part of the agenda with the following alteration in regard to Standing Order 2.1, option C be adopted in relation to moving and seconding and speaking to amendments. Seconded Councillor Staines. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Against? Carried. Item 5, declarations of interest. Members are reminded of the need to stand aside from decision making if conflicts arise. And I'll move that Council, there's no amendments to the, so I'll move that Council notes the elected members' interest register and confirms the proposed management plan for elected members' interest, and that Council notes the executive leadership team's interest register. Second to Councillor Staines. No discussion. I'll put it. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against? Carried. We move on to confirmation of minutes. Item 6. I'll move that the Council confirms the public part of the minutes of the ordinary Council meeting held on the 30th of October 2018 is a correct record. Second to Councillor Staines. Any discussion? I'll put it. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against? Carried. Item 7, Audit and Risk Subcommittee. Councillor Lord.
I'd just like to move that, actually I'll do a Councillor Wiley trick and ask that we note the minutes of items 7, 8 and 9, which is the Audit and Risk Subcommittee meetings held on the 26th of April, 14th of June and the 31st of October, and also that we take the Part C items in the non-public part of the meeting.
Okay. There seems to be more detail in your resolution than is on the...
Oh, I was going to do 7, 8 and 9 altogether.
Oh, yeah, right, okay. Second to Councillor Staines. Any discussion? I'll put it. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against? Carried. Oh, I see, sorry. Gotcha. So we're right down to item 10. Councillor Wiley.
Yes, Your Worship. I would like to move the minutes of the Community Board meetings, items 10, 11, 12, 13 and 14.
Seconded Councillor Elder. Any discussion? I'll put it. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against? Carried. Okay, we're on to reports proper. Item 15, temporary alcohol ban for orientation 2019. Can I invite Mr. Pickford, Mr. Blair and Mr. Meakin? Or any two thereof. Welcome. Now, does either of you wish to introduce this, or do you want to go straight into questions? Questions, Councillor Wilson.
Apologies, and I should have asked this question earlier and I forgot to. The clarity of the proposal to have variable hours of when the ban applies and not is problematic for signage, and isn't it? I mean, it's generally a rule provides for a certain time of starting and same time of ending, and I'm just wondering. I'm not opposed to what you're trying to do, but the hours, the variability of the hours concerns me.
In the past, we've had variable hours, and with only 4 nights, it's not a problem on the signage.
Thank you.
Councillor Elder.
Thank you, Chair. Just a question regarding the feedback on the effectiveness over the past few years. From my perception, things are getting better and better, but what kind of feedback have you had on the work that you've done in the previous years?
The OUSA advised that the security people that they have at the gates find it a lot easier to identify people that are intoxicated walking toward them, and the rubbish, the skips put around the place so that the rubbish is put into it while they're more sober. They don't have to do as many checks at the doors because they can identify people from further away. That seems to be working really well.
Added to that, what is the public perception of behaviour and things like that?
Not sure what the public perception is because it really only relates to North Dunedin and those in there, and they're predominantly students.
Any further questions? Would someone like to move this? Councillor Garrick moved. Second, Councillor Lord. Do you wish to speak to it? Any other speakers? There being none, I'll put it. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against? Carried. Thank you. Item 16, Everton Road Subdivision, Local Purpose Reserve Road proposal. I think Mr Saunders and Mr Fisher. Either of them here? Right. Not yet. No, I haven't accepted it yet. I wanted to make sure that we covered all the bases first. Who moved? You moved, Councillor Lord and Councillor Newell. Okay, but anyway, does anyone have any questions about this? Right, if there are no questions, then we don't need to interrogate any further. Councillor Lord, do you wish to speak to this? Does any other speakers? There being none, I'll put it. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against? Carried. Item 17, Mayor's Task Force for Housing Interim Report. You're here, Paul. Welcome. Ms Reid, Mr Christie. Right. Do you wish to introduce this or do you want to go straight to questions? No, it should be on.
Okay. Just a very brief introduction, if that's all right, Your Worship.
Sure.
I'm here actually representing a cross-council team of people who have contributed to this report. The interim report from the task force identifies a number of need across the city, and that is an interim report, so the second report will identify some more concrete things to do. The recommendations basically focus on advocacy, leadership and funding, and that are issues that need to be addressed with central government and other agencies. Happy to take any questions.
Questions, councillors? Councillor Wiley.
Thank you. I know this is a new committee, new setup. Has any discussion taken place and looked at and done an audit on what land is available and suitable, and like with Housing New Zealand and the other entities, or are we too early in the process yet?
Housing New Zealand are well aware of what land they have available to them and what land that could be developed. That's been mentioned in the meetings. And the city through the 2GP is also very, very aware of what land is available.
So I'm thinking with, again, combination of 2GP, housing across the city, again, they're talking 650 short, and I notice in paragraph 7 it talks about the growth and the number of houses versus the growth, and by my numbers we're over 500 short in that area itself. Are we looking at, or is there any investigation through the council at releasing more land? Because obviously land, to me, seems to be one of the biggest restraints. Obviously, if you put more land on the market, there's more supply can be generated.
So
if I can say, maybe we don't own great swathes of land that we're sitting on waiting to release onto the market, Councillor Wiley. So we can only release land or put it on the market if we own it, and we don't. So this is private enterprise. The purpose of 2GP, and maybe one of the councillors that's been intensively involved in 2GP can give you some advice about the bits of land that are ready to be built on, the bits of land that are transitional pieces to be released in zone changes as the demand for housing comes online and as the infrastructure is put into service it. But that's the mechanism. The mechanism isn't that we have land we put on the market.
Okay, so So we have, so just for clarification of that, so we have no land that would alleviate in any way?
We have some small pockets of land that that could perhaps be repurposed. Obviously not reserve, and there's some issues around that, and some of those are being have been talked about as being made potentially available for developers to build on if there's an interest. So they're being they're being talked about as they're known of.
And then obviously with those restraints and those constraints, I'm taking the fact that are we doing enough to help developers release or create and red carpet process for them to start their developments and work in partnership here?
I'm not sure that that's a question of the, and I take it may be even a rhetorical question, but it's not really a question of the task force. Their remit was to identify what the need is. Your question is more probably of council, actually, but you are aware that that is precisely what the 2GP is for.
And the red carpet project, of course. So our consenting time is lower than it's been. It's consistently, that time frame's consistently come down over the last while. Both the building resource consents have stayed under the 20 days. Building consents, that time frame for consenting has consistently been pegged back and back to being well within the legal time frame. If we get good documentation, you get your consent pretty quickly. So I think the red carpet project out of the council seems, as far as the feedback I'm aware of, has been working very well.
I still see, I'm trying to find a way to, I see a supply and demand problem obviously very clearly, and I guess the task force is seeing that too. So can you outline for me, and some of it's already in the report, some clear measures of how that's going to, the task force is going to activate that sooner rather than later?
Can I just make the point that the task force isn't going to activate anything. Their job was to ascertain what the need is in the first instance. Task force won't be doing anything about it because they were an investigative group.
There is a national policy statement on land supply. That work's being done on that at the moment, Councillor Wiley. That'll be early in the new year, so you might be interested to, and we'll be briefing councillors as to where that takes us as well.
Okay. How have discussions gone then with the other housing providers and the spaces they have? Are they fully occupied? Are they?
Around the room, most of the housing providers are there saying that they actually have waiting lists. The example would be with our own community housing, we now have quite a substantial waiting list that in the past we didn't have such a waiting list. Housing New Zealand is on the same issue. And some of the more social providers have this difficulty in finding accommodation as well for their clients.
And is there, I noticed there are some couple of developers that are on the task force, and what are they referencing?
Unfortunately, we don't have any developers on the task force. We have two property real estate companies who actually provide property services to a number of rental properties, quite a number in fact.
Okay, so the property developers mentioned here aren't on the task force?
Fortunately, no, but no one accepted our invitation.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Hawkins. All right, thank you. Councillor Wilson.
Interesting recommendations. The one area that doesn't seem to be reflected in the recommendations, and I'm not saying, I appreciate there's more work to be done on delving down to which is going to be the lowest hanging fruit maybe, is the financial restraints or constraints when you get potentially developments like the co-housing and the models that requires, and the other is papakāinga, and the financial models that make that type of accommodation provision. Have you looked into that and just discounted it, or have I missed it in reading the report? Apologies if I have.
There's an attempt in the task force report under funding, where that's one of the things they want council to lobby on, is to change the way that investment is made, and that in the past central government has made direct investment into a number of community and social housing ventures. It's changed now through income-related rent subsidies and accommodation supplement. What the task force is saying is that's not working, and they want us to lobby for a different method of doing that.
Councillor Gary.
Thank you, Your Worship. Third time lucky. It seems to me that it's a very collaborative, productive exercise that has been embarked on by the group. And my question is a bit of a tangent in relation to point 16 around the report due out in mid-2019 by Enterprise Dunedin. And this is in relation to the number of workers with the hospital rebuild. What's the significance of that date in terms of the release of the report? If in fact there is a significance in the date.
I think it's just the compounding nature of the requirements that are going to be required around housing. So that date that has been signalled was the hospital rebuild date. So we know that there's going to be, for the 5 or 6 year window of building, a ramping up of skills that are going to be required, and that's going to bring a lot of additional workers into the city.
Councillor O'Malley.
Thanks very much for this report, and I'm sort of going to touch on something around point 7 and the QV changes, but really point 14, where you say that the sheer scale of housing needs in Auckland and other cities is overshadowing us potentially. Could you comment on, we seem to be increasing our population quite quickly in the last few years, and yet statistics are always gained sort of in the previous period, so often as not your description of your city reflects what it was 5 or 6 years ago. Do you think it's possible that we may be changing faster than we can analyse our change? And I guess then at that point case, if we are, do we need to be even more ramped up in thinking about where this growth could happen? And then I'm going to ask, and then can you fit on one last question? What's our homelessness like in Dunedin?
If I start on the first question, measuring homelessness is quite difficult. There are people who, the term is they choose to be homeless, as they have places where they could go, and there's a small number of those, but with that exception, do you count couch surfing as homelessness? What do you count? So it's a very difficult measure to do, unfortunately, so I can't give an answer on that. And whether to our growth, as you say, statistics are always behind, and unfortunately, we're a long way behind now because the stats we have been using is 2013. So I just think the national policy statement, when that comes out, which is being worked on right now, and I think that's due in February or January, I'm not quite sure, that will give us a better indication of where we're at. And because we're now a medium growth city, we're required to produce one of those on a regular basis and keep a better check on that.
Councillor Lord.
Yeah, look, I just had a question. I see in point 7 it says the task force noted that those with unmet housing needs will be overrepresented by people of Maori and Pacifica and also people with disabilities. Now, I'm just wondering, when we build our own housing, when we develop new sections and new blocks, the particular area of disability that you're talking there, or that the task force noted, are they like physical disabilities that need more than wheelchair ramps, or are these different types of disabilities? Are these mental health issues? Do we cater for people with disabilities in our units at the moment?
There's two parts to the answer. The task force has recommended because statistically, nationally, and the indication from Ministry of Social Development here is that Maori and Pacifica are disproportionately representative in the poor housing stats, and that's what the task force is focused on there. With regard to accessibility, where the task force report focused is that housing, if you're building a private landlord or a private developer is building a new house, they don't have to provide for accessibility. The council, as in the DCC community housing, is caught by the particular part of the Building Act and Code where we have to meet the accessibility requirements, but providers like Housing New Zealand or other providers do not have to meet the accessibility requirements. Now, what the task force was driving at is that we encourage anybody building houses to make it accessible or adopt the universal design principles so it adapts for the community and is more flexible.
I guess what I was trying to ask a wee bit was the type of disabilities you're referring to in the report. Are they physical disabilities, or is that mentally ill, or?
The universal design principles cover all of that, so it covers physical, mental, those types of things. So it's inclusive of all disabilities.
But it's also worth noting that people with disabilities, both people with experience of mental illness and people with physical disabilities, do tend to be are overrepresented in the underhoused. Yep.
Any further questions? Councillor Elder.
Thank you, Chair. Just this week, well, today, Labor announced sweeping changes in housing and the urban development authorities, and I'm just wondering what your thoughts are around that and central government coming in on that.
It's a very recent announcement, as you said.
Yes, it was.
And I know some of the sector were actually expecting Housing New Zealand to be included in it. But I also note that they are seeking a dialogue with local government, and I do think that's an opportunity for this council to come along with some solutions and hopefully be one of the first cabs off the rank. That's...
Further questions? There are none. Would Councillor Hawkins, you said you moved. Is there a seconder, please? Councillor Benson-Pope. Councillor Hawkins, do you wish to speak to it?
Yeah, thank you, Your Worship. I think one of the things that this council can be most proud of over the last decade is the development of our strategic framework, because it is, in essence, a set of our community's ambitions and aspirations across a wide range of well-beings that in that time have been taken out and are about to be readmitted into the local purpose of the Local Government Act, rather than the individual aspirations or ambitions of elected members or staff of council. And we may disagree about how to achieve those objectives, and we may disagree around the relative priority of some of those strategic objectives, but it's an incredibly helpful basis upon which to guide our investment and our decision making. The social wellbeing strategy was the first of these to be developed, and better housing outcomes for our community is one of the three core planks of our social wellbeing strategy. It hasn't been so prominent in the discussions around this table as many of the more recent strategies have been, and I'm as guilty of that as anyone in terms of focus on environmental outcomes, arts and culture outcomes, economic development outcomes. And I've been thinking a bit over the weekend as to why that hasn't been as prominently discussed around here. And I think part of it is because it's too hard and it's too complex. But I think, and this has been alluded to in the discussion and the questions up until this point, I don't think we really got a sense of how urgent a conversation this has subsequently become. We talk about things around the quality of housing. Now, that was always something that we knew required regulation, and that was initially impossible and then inevitable, both under the previous government and more recently under the current one. Around issues of affordability, I think we've been in denial really around the shift in market values relative to people's ability to particularly first home buyers, to be able to buy them. And of course, when you own property or multiple properties, there's only an upside to rising property values. And I think, you know, the Urban Development Capacity Report, the first of the NPS-UDC reports that came out of planning, really highlighted the issues that we were facing around rising housing affordability as being a rising issue, and also issues around housing our more vulnerable communities, as has been discussed around social housing and public housing. As the paper outlines, we had a report that said we needed 1,000 more units by 2031. It's pretty easy to ignore something that has an end date of 2031. And so I don't know if it was as prominent without an understanding of what the current need was. And all of this, of course, is before you know, the recent increases in population here, changes of demographics, designation as a former refugee resettlement centre, all adding to, you know, the workforce required for the major capital projects in the city, all compounding the issues that we were facing, and we were at risk of sleepwalking into a housing crisis of our own here in Dunedin. And the Mayor's Task Force for Housing really set up to try and get ahead of some of these issues for the city, not just for the council. It's worth noting and emphasising really that the task was not just to make recommendations to council, but to all parties, government, central government, government agencies, private developers and community housing providers and council, anybody who has a stake in trying to address these. In terms of housing quality issues, the task force played a pretty key role in developing council's submissions on the regulations around the Healthy Homes guarantee work and the early stages of the review of tenancy law. The affordability stuff, or at least the supply side of that, will be dealt with under the NPS-UDC and other tools that are prescribed under the RMA as to how we are monitoring that. But as housing becomes more unaffordable, we're seeing increasing numbers of people in our community at the mercy of the rental market and the challenges that comes with that. The group's focus, the task force's focus from the outset was to focus on the needs of our most vulnerable people, and that was a discussion around social and public housing. We needed 1,000 by 2031, but how many units are we short today? And while, as the paper outlines, getting exact data is problematic, the best estimate that we could come to was that there's around a deficit currently of around 650. And that was certainly a surprise to me, and I think it came as a shock to many people to see the scale of that problem and the scale of the challenge that we face. In the interim, we've had a change of government and a change of direction from Housing New Zealand, who haven't built any or added any additional capacity really for a considerable amount of time. They've announced 14 new units in Dunedin, which is not quite close to 650, but I think it's heartening that they are at least back in the business of adding capacity in our community. This is an interim report. There'll be a subsequent one to follow with more concrete suggestions, I suppose, designed to feed into council and various government departments' budget setting processes, and these will be further refined. But one of them is around the creation of a Dunedin Housing Action Plan, and I think this is, rather than get into a debate around what the relative merits of each of these individual recommendations are, I'm proposing that we adopt all of them and then take a more considered approach to crystallising those into some tangible actions to come out of both this and the final report that comes out in May or June of next year. There are some specific things that are worth highlighting, I think. The recommendations around making tenants of council housing qualify for income-related rents, which at present they're not available, and that is not much of an incentive for us to provide additional public housing. A decision made by government basically to leave the provision or encourage the provision of public housing to be left up to the private market or community not-for-profit sector and not local councils. So I think that that is something that has come through quite strongly in the conversations at the task force, and I think it is something that we do need to push for, as well as working with the government to collaboratively plan for further investment in public housing. It's disappointing at this point that the government have said that both of those things are off the table, but it's the job of this body as advocates for the needs of our community to lobby them to change their mind sooner rather than later. Further down the line, we're looking at things like local tools to encourage affordable portions or a proportion of affordable housing within both private and public development. And as has been mentioned, better design and accessibility standards in new builds and all of the energy efficiency, environmental and future-proofing benefits that come with that. This is step one of the work. Step two will be the final report, and then the Dunedin Housing Action Plan will follow through from that. This resolution progresses that, but point 3 is incredibly important in that it recognises that there is currently insufficient resourcing within this organisation to do the necessary work with the urgency that is required. So I just wanted to flag that up, that needs to be part of our budget setting process through the annual plan 2019-2020, so that from 1 July 2020 there is adequate support on staff for us to be able to progress this. Just quickly, and I'll save the full round of thank yous because I'm aware I have to do this again in 6 months' time, but I would like to thank all of the staff and the task force membership, some of whom are present, who have given up their time to be part of this discussion, and in particular to Chris Gladell and Scott Figgenshaw from Community Housing Aotearoa, who have facilitated the workshops for us. But I'm always reminded, as we've gone through this process, of the comments made by Louise Carr from PACT at our first meeting that said, we've all been here before having these same conversations and we got to the end and nothing happened. And we were quite adamant from the beginning that we wouldn't, this wouldn't be another 12 months of sitting around navel-gazing without any firm outcomes from it. So I'm looking forward to seeing the action part of the work program develop over the next 6 months and start to address some of the challenges that are facing our community today. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor O'Malley.
I'm happy to see this report come in, and I think to my questions that I asked, I'm just going to follow up on them basically as an observation. I believe that the city is about to go through a lot of growth, and we may in fact be behind in our planning for addressing that. We're seeing a 10% increase in property prices, which is quite a steep one from the previous. In that, I also want to make sure, and I hope we address it, that we're not just looking at the supply of houses, but we're also looking at people investing in houses. And whether or not speculation in housing is also causing an increase in property pricing. So I would hope that we are capturing not just a supply and demand for those who want to make this their first house, but whether or not, in fact, the barrier to them getting their first house is someone's bought their 6th or 7th house. So I hope that we will address that because it's not currently captured in the particular scope. The other thing that I'm hoping the city will move forward is I quite like these ideas of a Dunedin Housing Action Plan, but in action has to come a mechanism of actually enacting. I would hope that we will go forward and find partnerships with those who might build these houses, and also carefully understand the role that we might play. We have a fairly large property portfolio outside the city, and we are addressing that right now. We might want to consider to what extent we will use that portfolio in the future as to whether or not we will do targeted investments. The idea here is that we've built a district plan which is encouraging us to intensify and not just give a whole heap of greenfield space and spread out across the land like every other city. But we have to get those intensified projects built, and I think we need to ask the question, what role will we play, and will it just be one of helping, or will it actually be an active player and actually being a player along with them? So I encourage these. I look forward to the third part, and that is I do want to have a discussion as to what we would do in terms of funding it, because I'm also a believer that the council shouldn't necessarily take, while it should be an active player, should not be the only player in these kind of things. And whether or not, in fact, we need to actively resource it that much, or whether, in fact, we need to get all the players in the room, and in and of itself, it will resource itself. So I'm happy to go with these particular motions, and I'm looking forward to that debate on the third one as the annual plan rocks around. Thanks.
Councillor Wiley.
Thank you, Worship. I will be supporting all 3 of these motions. When I look at this paper, and I totally respect that it's a start, but when I look at the numbers and we see right now there's a shortage of 650 as of when the report was written, that's probably in 18 months' time going to be closer to 1,000 based on the growth we're having. I just hope that right across council we look at every which way we can to release land, improve the pathway for developers and to action construction, and to really build some good, strong partnerships to make this happen. One of the things as I read through this report is it looked like, it takes money. And people look out there and they say, well, where's the funding going to come from? And one of the things we learnt last week when we had our finance report is that Waipori Fund has 42% of it is in fixed interest. And in the last 12 months up to June 30th, had a 4.8% return. Now, anybody coming into building housing is always going to look for a return. But I think if we even looked at an opportunity of taking a small portion, possibly 10, maybe $15 million of the Waipori Fund and set that up as a seed fund from fixed interest and moved it into housing development for community housing to increase our platform and to increase our community outcomes, I think would a possibility. Now that's not going to be answered today, it's not going to be answered in a few months, but hopefully it'll be answered soon. The other part that I looked at is that, and anybody who goes through South Dunedin can see very clearly the date of those buildings, most were built, back in the early 20s and beyond. And it's even some pre-1900. I don't think many of us would actually, or those who built those houses back in 1900 would actually expect those houses to still be standing today. Those houses were probably built for one generation to live in, and that was it. And then we look on the other side, we look at the Polytech, we look at the building where they're actually using body heat to heat the buildings, to heat the rooms. Now, somewhere in there is our story of what we should be doing in South Dunedin to actually have great outcomes for all. I don't have the answers, but I see a pathway there, and I see a report here that really touches on, and I hope the rest of the community that are asked to come to the table, come to the table. It's frustrating to hear that there are no developers sitting at the table right now when that's what's requested. But I think there's a really good pathway, but my frustration, and I can totally understand it's going to be from the people sitting at this table, writing these reports and presenting these reports, is time. We don't have a lot of it because we're all going to pay for it down the line. Thank you.
To the speakers. Well, I support these resolutions. I note, as some of the other speakers have, that this is really the start. We needed to get a handle on the issue, and I think the next stages are going to be more challenging, as has been pointed out. Several speakers have pointed out that it's going to take resourcing, so we are going to have to find, if we're going to, as council, resource this financially, we're going to have to find that from somewhere. I think the other issue, and this goes back to the advocacy that's proposed here, we also need to be urging the government to remove some of the roadblocks, some of the challenges to councils facilitating development. And I note that one of the main reasons that the Urban Development Authority has been set up in the way it has is that the constraints that councils work under, having to fit in with the RMA, which has been tinkered with and made more contorted and complex over the years, and fitting in with having to comply with their own district plans, etc., has meant that it's very difficult, and has been very difficult, for even in high need situations for councils to facilitate development. And we've seen that in the high growth areas like Auckland, Tauranga and Hamilton. And the UDA, as it's been set up, is specifically designed to overcome those challenges. So our advocacy has got to be to central government to allow councils to work to the same rules as the central government is going to be allowed to. Otherwise, we'll end up with a two-tier system where councils can't do all the hard stuff and government takes credit for doing all the easy stuff because it's made new rules for itself which overrule the rules that councils have to abide by. So I think this advocacy proposals here are going to be very important. We need to be liberated from some of those constraints too. And I do pick up on Councillor Wiley's point that there is no point, if we're going to expand the supply of housing, there's no point in building it to 30 or 40-year-old standards. It's not unreasonable to claim that building standards in this country are inadequate for our conditions. They're not good enough now. So we certainly shouldn't be building a whole lot of new stuff to those old standards. As we expand the housing supply, we need to be lifting the standard at the same time. Councillor Hawkins, you're right to reply.
Thank you, Your Worship. I'm just picking up on a couple of things that have come on the way through. Just for clarification, really, the shortfall that's outlined in the report of 650 plus units isn't a housing shortfall across the city. It's a shortfall of supply of social housing or public housing, which is housing that can be afforded by people on fixed and low incomes. And I would say this, the decisions that were arrived to through the second generation district plan process show that the supply of housing generally across the district is adequate to meet our short and medium term needs. It's just that it turns out people don't really want to build, the market doesn't want to deliver affordable housing in the way that our community needs it. And we share the task force shares the frustration around the lack of developer input into the conversations that we have. It certainly wasn't through lack of trying on our part to recruit some to be a part of that process. The planning for population growth is something that we now have to do is under the RMA, under the NPS UDC, and we've heard that the reports will come back in January, although I take Councillor O'Malley's point that these are often retrospective assessments rather than, because you can't, by definition, predict what's going to happen, although we do have to meet demand, what is the calculation of demand plus 20%, which gives us some confidence, I guess, in what that supply is looking like. And to the question of how active council should be in it, it's clear to all parties that we can't do it alone, nor can central government. It requires both parties and the private sector and not-for-profits and social housing providers to be able to fix a challenge of the magnitude that we have. But that said, I do think council will need to plan for further capital investment in the provision of housing, and my personal view is that we can achieve that without selling off the Waipori Fund in the process. These aren't mutually exclusive. Maintaining an asset base for investment and investing in the social needs of our community. And just lastly, I think one of the things that I found the most challenging about this process is the difficulty that we have tying ourselves in knots, coming up with the best public policy outcomes that we can, essentially accepting people being poor as an act of nature akin to gravity. That there will always be people, whether they're on social welfare or on a low income, that just can't afford to live. And I think, while that is, speaking of things that are outside our remit, was certainly outside the scope of the remit of our conversations, but it is certainly a huge factor in that affordability is more than just the price. It's also the capacity that people have to pay that price, and that's something that we as a society, I think, need to pay careful attention to as a very important factor in addressing these challenges. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I'm going to put it. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against? Carried. Thank you. Division.
Councillor Elder? Yes. Councillor Gary? Aye. Councillor Hall? Aye. Councillor Hawkins? Aye. Councillor Lefiso? Aye. Councillor Lord? Aye. Councillor Newell? Aye. Councillor O'Malley? Aye. Councillor Staines? Aye. Councillor Steedman? Aye. Councillor Vandervis? No. Councillor Wilson? Aye. Councillor Wiley? Yes. Your Worship?
Aye.
Carried 14-1.
Thank you. Thank you, team. Now we'll go on to item 18, DCC submission on the National Disaster Resilience Strategy. Welcome, Ms. Oanu. Ms. Graham. All right. Oh, an expert. Do you wish to introduce this?
No, we're happy to take questions, Your Worship.
Questions, councillors? Councillor Hawkins.
Thank you, Your Worship. Just around the commentary in the background, in that we are working with council, I assume it means is working with community boards to develop localised response plans. What is the approach to doing that in the metropolitan area in terms of working with local groups to be able to develop that capacity?
We are working with groups, place-based groups as well. So, for example, we're in the midst of a response plan with the South Dunedin community, and there are a number of other communities that we're looking at, but South D is the first non-community board one, the Mosgiel Tyree one is in place, and some of the more low-lying community areas that are technically within community boards, but will have their own plans. I think Aramoana, Long Beach, areas like that.
And I don't know if we have any more control over community boards than we do around place-based groups, but is there a shared understanding of when it's expected that those will be completed?
So there is a timetable that has been signed off by the Joint Committee for the delivery of the first tranche of plans, and so they take from inception to delivery upwards of 18 months to be, fully talked through and worked out with the community.
Councillor Elder.
This National Disaster Resilience Strategy draft for consultation appears very, very thorough and well put together. I think it's fantastic, and your work with place-based and community boards is to be commended. Now, I had a question, and it's gone. I was just wondering also your work with our Māori communities and what's happening there regarding to that.
So the Joint Committee is also really interested in that and have a plan at a regional level for engaging with Māori, but locally, as part of the plans that we're developing in areas, for example, on the peninsula, we work with local marae and the local runanga on how best to deliver resilience within their communities. So it's a community-based approach, but that's what we've done to date. It's likely to be something that we discuss further with the Māori Participation Working Party once the Joint Committee has given us a slightly more a clear direction on what they would like to see.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor O'Malley.
Just thinking of disaster mitigation, going back to my community board. With the work that we've done so far on these plans, will this change much of the work that's gone on so far, or is basically what we're doing in line with what's going on right now?
We're fully aligned with what's proposed in the national strategy.
Thanks.
Any further questions? Councillor Newell.
Thank you, Worship. We've talked a number of times regarding resilience around the idea of a rain radar and whether or not we can actually get one for these here parts. I'm just wondering if there's any progress on that and if it's part of the overall thinking.
There have been further discussions, but as I understand it, that work hasn't progressed.
Councillor Elder.
Just thank you, Chair. I was just referring to Neighbours Day next year. It's on March the 22nd to the 30th, where it encourages neighbours to get together. And is there any thought of connecting it with building more resilience and looking after each other's neighbours, etc., in that kind of civil defence and emergency kind of way?
Yes, so that's an ongoing conversation we have, particularly with neighbourhood support, and so our team are working with neighbourhood support and other groups with Neighbours Day and other events like that where we can build those messages through.
Councillor Gary.
Thank you. A tangential question, because it's been very much, we're aware of it from yesterday. The test alerts, this is really at you, Glenn, the test alert that happened yesterday, a lot of question in the community about how they check, because we won't know till next year how many people got that alert and how many didn't, how they can themselves take responsibility for doing anything that might mean they do receive it in the future. Is there any message that you would have on that? I know it's not connected with what we're really supposed to be discussing, but I do think it's something in the community mind today.
Yeah, it's part of the bigger picture about the community resilience and the communication within it. So the estimation is that around about half of the population would have received that alert based on the technology that people are currently carrying around with them. That will grow over time as both the infrastructure and people's handsets develop. But constantly the message that we're putting out with any sort of informative messaging around warnings is to ensure that your family, friends and neighbours are also aware. So the messaging through the technology is just the first step in that communication train, and that we're then expecting the community to communicate amongst itself to spread that message further.
I guess I need to be more specific about my questions. So where you might have three, as we did in our household, a fairly recent phone, a fairly up-to-date phone, then one that was a smartphone but maybe not as recent, and then an older phone, you might think the older phone won't receive the text alert. That's a reasonable assumption. The technology is not quite up to it. The confusion, I think, in the community is around why some smartphones are receiving it and some aren't.
That's the ongoing work that the Ministry of Civil Defence Emergency Management is having with the telecommunication providers around, and that's why they do the annual test to look for what are the gaps and why do those gaps exist. Is it an operating system issue within certain handsets, or is it I believe there are still probably some cell towers that need to be upgraded to be delivering the message. So it's that sort of work that's still ongoing, and that will be driven by the results of yesterday's test.
Thank you for your answer, and I guess that really means there's nothing individuals can do to ensure that they will receive it.
Other than to communicate amongst themselves and recognise there'll probably always be a shortfall, and that there should be that planning amongst the community to share that information amongst itself.
Questions? Happy to move. Councillor Wilson, seconded. Councillor Hall, do you wish to speak to it, Councillor Wilson? Any other speakers? I'll put it. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against? Carried. Thank you. I think we'll move on to item 19, the retrospective DCC submission on the new independent infrastructure body. Mr. Drew, I think you're coming to join us as well. Welcome. Welcome to your inaugural appearance before Council, Mr. Drew. We'll be as gentle as possible. Okay, do you wish to introduce this or right. Questions?
Taken as read.
Yeah. Questions, Councillor Lord.
Yeah, look, I just had a question in the submission about clause 3. It talks about the DCC recommends a new independent infrastructure body, specifically recognises local government bodies as owners. Do you think there's any view at a high level that this would ever be seen as different to that? Is there a risk, do you think?
Yeah, my personal opinion is yes, because local government owns a significant portion of New Zealand's infrastructure, so I'd be... Sorry, is that better? Yeah, my opinion is probably yes, given that we own a significant value of the nation's infrastructure. I can't say definitively, but it'll be difficult for central government to do it without us.
there be a risk that they might somehow try and take over our assets, is perhaps where I was angling. Do you think that, is there any thought at a higher level that they may try and take over our water, for example, our utilities, our pipes, and administer it differently? That's what I was meaning.
Yes, well, that's always a risk. I can't see it being through the infrastructure body. I think that has a different remit, and that's to facilitate a national look at infrastructure. And you know, for example, the Penlink project, where there's been a significant infrastructure deficit, and we've got problems with funding infrastructure. There's going to be these new and novel mechanisms for delivering infrastructure. And Penlink's one where a foreign consortium has come to the government and said, you know, we're keen to deliver this project. I can see the infrastructure body facilitating those types of discussions. You know, for example, for the waterfront, if someone was to come to us and say, you know, we'll deliver the waterfront for you, DCC, it's unlikely that we have the skills internally to understand all the risks and pros and constraints with such a model. So I see this infrastructure body being a front for that kind of stuff, and looking at infrastructure across all of New Zealand. But to specifically answer your question, that will always be a risk, but I can't see this body being that vehicle for it.
Generally, for example, with water around the country, I would imagine most councils would run that not too bad, I mean, with some degree of difference, I suppose, but do you think initially when you look at infrastructure and looking at infrastructure that we might be short on, would that be perhaps more in the line of bridges and, you know, national highways and things like that would be the bigger risk, or is this generally talking about things that council deliver but perhaps doing poorly?
Yes, so I think it's more set up for the bigger things and to help smaller councils facilitate big projects. And yeah, so in my previous role, I've worked with a lot of smaller local authorities, and they have even a lower base of expertise than us. So, you know, DCC successfully delivered a $50 million project, for example. That would be harder to deliver in a smaller local authority. So I see this body potentially providing skills and expertise to smaller councils. And if we were to deliver a $250 million project, for example, where we might need to resource up and have some more expertise to draw on, that's where we could go to a body such as the infrastructure body.
Councillor Wilson.
Thank you, Your Worship. Thank you, and I'm very happy to move this when the time's right for that. Just one question of the failings of infrastructure in New Zealand that may have precipitated some of this, the need or the consideration for this, has been, to my mind, the enforcement of standards. And I note, and it's not a criticism of the submission, but sort of in line with the previous questions, where will things like water testing and quality controls or discharge testing, is that conceived to be part of this? Because that seems to me to be one of the failings.
Well, I don't think it's specifically in the infrastructure body's remit at the moment, but there is another discussion going on in central government about water reform, and it's likely to start with tougher regulation around drinking water, and it could move to wastewater and stormwater, and it's plausible that regulation might be put into such a body. I don't think that's where it's how it's being pitched to us at this stage, but I just can't say with certainty.
I can answer that to some extent. The discussion around water is, as Mr Drew says, starting with the regulatory environment. And that regulatory environment, it's not clear whether it will just be around drinking water safety standards, or whether it will expand to environmental standards, and whether it might even expand further to economic regulation, depending on what the model is for delivery of water services. But at no stage in my conversations, and I've been involved in them quite heavily, has this overlapped with this infrastructure space. So
Thank you. That's some clarity.
Councillor Gary.
Thank you, Your Worship. I had a question which relates to page 115, the second last paragraph. Upon reading the report and the supporting documents, it was obvious that there were going to be significant benefits to such a body, but I note the comment in our submission in the second last paragraph: a new independent body holds promise but could add a further complexity. Could you comment further on that? Is that a significant concern? And could you just comment on that a little, please?
Yeah, so I think the comments around that at the moment, there's a whole lot of overlapping layers of regulations and standards. So we've got 30-year infrastructure plan, capital intention plans, long-term plans, and so there's a concern that this adds another overlapping complexity. And so the comment's just trying to say, can we streamline the multiple things that we're following into something more coherent and streamlined?
So would it be fair to say that there's an opportunity here for making it more streamlined, the word you used, as opposed to more complex, but there is a possibility it could become more complex? Would that be a fair comment?
Yeah, it's always a possibility. And so our comment is around, it's already complex. Let's see if we can, use this body to make it less complex.
Councillor O'Malley.
Thanks very much. Just want to clarify a couple of points sort of on what your vision that this body might end up doing. And I'm looking at the second point in our letter, and the second sentence says, the body could bring long-term infrastructure strategy and planning with a national perspective. To what extent do you think this body would be involved in actual planning for territorial authorities? And would it ultimately at some point or another look to, or maybe the first step towards, establishing national strategies which would superimpose over and above a planning strategy of a territorial authority?
Unclear how it would track. What I think is, in my previous role, I see councils doing things in silos, and not looking at the wider industry. So, for example, Otago, Queenstown Lakes also has a significant infrastructure spend. We have a significant infrastructure spend. Then there's all the other smaller authorities. I haven't seen any kind of joined up planning to go to the market with and say, this is where our peaks and troughs are, and could we move resources from here to here at this time and balance this with that? I'm hopeful that such a body would help coordinate that kind of balance.
Would you, so you would say for an Otago body, let's say, obviously we could coordinate together and that should make us all work more efficiently. If it was a national body, where 30% of the population is Hamilton or North, and that was the single body, which is more or less what this is proposing, how do you believe our population would fare in terms of equity of spend and sitting in the better business case, where often is not volume and size as a determining factor?
Oh yeah, it's a really good question. I share your concern. I would hope that there's regional representation on such a board, and we have someone from Dunedin or Christchurch to advocate for the regions, but it's not something I would have much influence with. I can only hope.
In sort of much the same way that we would have an Otago representative on the New Zealand Transport. Sorry.
I think we also referred in the submission to the need for the new infrastructure body to not just look at immediate issues, but to look at places like Dunedin who are being identified as future growth areas. And I think because the infrastructure body's remit is to look longer term, that also may aid us to have a more balanced distribution of thinking and resourcing coming outside of that high growth areas currently.
Which would be the underlying philosophy of any centralised decision-making board that had regional representation and then aggregation of regional concepts into a national policy, like NZTA does right now.
That's right. I mean, we're always going to have those problems. I think it'll fall on ourselves and council to stand up and advocate for us if we feel like we're being left out.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Wiley.
Thank you, Your Worship. That actually is quite a good segue, because some of my concerns were answered in Councillor O'Malley's questions. And the first question I had, and just if you could elaborate any further, is are there any other negatives for Dunedin in this?
No, personally, I can't see any other negatives. That was my major concern, the same one that Councillor O'Malley's talked about. I would hope that the body is of benefit to the industry. I'm new to local government, so I'm not too sure about the nuances between the central government, local government relationship. But I see such a body being of benefit to the industry, the consultants and the contractors, and we're going to rely on the industry to help us deliver our ambitious LTP and all the other things that are happening in the city. So I feel that such a body will only add value to that, not detract from it.
Okay, perfect. And then, as I was reading through this report, it sort of dawned on me, would it not make sense for the DCC to set up something similar, obviously on a smaller scale, but a bit like what's happening with the hospital rebuild, but and also the harbour side, but a lot of what's happening around the city and a lot of cross-sector, like an infrastructure working party. I wouldn't say committee, but working party.
Yeah, absolutely. It's something I think would add value, but given I'm new to my role, I'm saying to myself and my teams up until Christmas, I'm just observation mode. After Christmas, I'll come out with a list of priorities where I think I could add value, and at this stage, that's on my list of priorities. And in my previous role, I'm well connected to other local councils, so I can help facilitate those kind of parties. But there is a massive infrastructure spend coming to this part of the world. We're not going to be able to deliver it BAU. We'll have to look at new and novel and joined up ways of delivering it. And I think that's something we must do probably next year, and give the industry a better gauge of where all our infrastructure spend is and when, and help smooth it out for the industry across the Otago region.
And again, I guess the next step forward from that was I was looking at, say, a Highlanders approach to that, with Otago and Southland having a committee that would then sort of, I sort of looked at it as a tier system through to the major infrastructure committee, so there was representations from the regions.
Yeah, well, that's how I think the national body would work. You'd have a regional infrastructure plan that's fed up to a national infrastructure plan and help coordinate it and prioritise. And that's a very good point, including Southland in our one, and because we're kind of a little bit lucky at the moment that the peak of the rebuild work in Christchurch is starting to tail off. So now's our time to be going to the industry and saying, you know, Christchurch is coming off a massive infrastructure peak, but Otago and Southland are coming into one. How do we shift, you know, the resources, the guys on the ground, the ladies on the ground down from Christchurch to Otago, and when and where is the best time to do that?
And there are several examples used here from the UK, Victoria and New South Wales. Have you seen those work as well? Are they good examples to be using?
I'm aware of them. I haven't lived and breathed them and worked under them. They're probably an okay model. I mean, I've worked within the UK model, which is good as well. So I don't have a strong preference for how. I personally think the concept of it could add value to New Zealand infrastructure, provided it is set up and established in the correct way.
Councillor Elder.
Thank you, Chair. My question is actually, I commend the City Council for point 7, the DCC proposes climate change adaptation to New Zealand's infrastructure is added as a core function, because in fact it's a big issue and will require quite a bit of money, but also expertise. What's your thoughts around that? Yeah.
I think we don't know exactly what we're asking for there, except to say, central government, please start to embed that across all of your work now. So, I mean, we obviously realise that we're not going to solve our climate change issues in Dunedin alone. And I think at the moment it's unclear quite how the partnership with central government may work, but I think the more that we have these conversations and open these dialogues, the more potential there is that central government start to come to the table on the climate change issue.
The other question related to that is when it comes to weighting or priority of need for spend, could that be one of the kind of platforms we can use when it comes to weighting the spend in Dunedin?
Yeah, I think we've spoken before about how spend around particularly the climate change issue may go across the country, and I think it's quite a critical time for Dunedin to start to really be advocating for investment from central government here for that to address those issues, because I think I'm not clear yet how any ranking might take place in terms of where best to spend money across the country to mitigate climate change impacts, and I think that poses risks for us as a city. I'm not sure how that ranking will be done, but I think it will be done.
Thank you.
Councillor Benson-Pope.
Thank you, Your Worship. I just wanted to come back to the issue of workforce planning, coordination or mapping or whatever that we were referring to in the earlier discussion, because it was my understanding that as a result of the work that spun out of the local advisory group on the hospital, the seminar with local contractors and businesses of various kinds that's happened as a result of that, and the coordination with the chamber, that work is already happening. Is that not the case?
Yeah, I think that is the case, but locally is my limited understanding. I'm not too sure that's happening across the entire Otago region and further afield.
As I understand it, that was the role involving the chamber. So I think there's obviously an identified need for more internal communication here, because all that work, as I understand it, is well underway.
Okay, yeah, that's probably just a function of my newness to the role. I haven't caught up to speed.
Any further questions? Right, would someone like to move Councillor Elder, second Councillor Gary? Councillor Elder, would you wish to speak to it in the first instance?
That's okay.
Thank Councillor O'Malley, you wish to speak.
This letter is a reasonable city's response, but I do have some concerns that I would like to raise as we're going forward with this, and that is that a centralised decision body can eventually become a centralised decision-making body, and it can eventually become a centralised resource distribution body. And you can have local components to that whole system of how you make up decisions. So I notice we talk about the regional transport plan here in this letter, and we do have that already with transport. So Otago and Southland do unite together in a regional transport committee, and what goes on in Queenstown is discussed in front of everybody else, and our opinions on resource distribution are in fact voiced there. But the reality of it is that once that regional land transport plan is put together, it is then sent to Wellington and shuffled into the national land transport plan. And people who have never visited this region are making the final decisions as to what happens. So there is a risk of centralisation, and that is that you become generalised. And so I probably would have preferred if this letter had been set past where we think to an even more louder state, so that we can bring the point up that there is a risk for us, because we're a city which is an unusual size. We are not big enough to be considered a metro under the transport system. Only Christchurch, Wellington and Auckland are, so we fall below that. And yet we're bigger than a small town that really does require central government investment to make it meet its ends meet. And I think that because of that we can fall into a dangerous place. And I would like to really make it clear that my feeling is that that's the danger that we face, is that when this body sets up, if this evolves into eventually a national planning body, which Treasury is setting this up, so Treasury tends to want to go in that direction once it gets going, then we could be finding ourselves again underrepresented, and that's my biggest concern here. The idea of pooling resources, pooling planning, coordinating things, I think that's fantastic. I would like the Treasury to consider something slightly different, which is to say that we do set up Otago Southland area and we work on how do we coordinate that together. And then that is submitted, but the relationship is light. Well, I hope this relationship remains light. I really would not want to see this advance to the point that it becomes, well, all the communities in the country have underinvested in their infrastructure, which I think this might be heading. We're seeing this with water. A lot of the towns that have kept their rates low have done it by simply ignoring infrastructure spends for years, and now they've gone and either, we've still got some towns in the Otago Southland region that put in raw sewage out, not properly treating it. So they are miles behind us in their infrastructure spend. They will have their hand out, rightfully, potentially from their perspective, to expect some of this money. So if we get caught up in the middle of that argument, I think we could end up being on the wrong side of it. So that's my only concern about going into this. And I'll support this letter, but I would also ask that I know that the government is coming out quite quickly with different submission requests, and we have a very tight time frame to ask on. But retroactively agreeing on a letter is, less than ideal. And I would ask that potentially, if we're going to write these letters, could we at least have a meeting beforehand? And if nobody bothers to turn up, then they've not bothered to turn up. But email may not be necessarily the best way in which to put into these letters, because you want to be able to voice something that can take 10 or, especially if I'm talking, could take 10 or 15 minutes to get to the point. But I don't want to sit down and write a 500-word essay either. So, it'd be quite nice if we can just bang out, say, a 30 or 40-minute meeting sometimes ahead of time before we construct these letters. Thank you.
Councillor Wilson.
Thank you, Your Worship. And taking the last, Councillor O'Malley's last point first, perhaps, I think this is an area that we could be looking at standing orders and delegations to the chairs and deputy chairs of certain committees to be involved in that process at an earlier stage to enable to allow staff to ramp up their ability to respond. As has been noted by many of us in the exchange of emails that we had, some of the timeframes been given for this consultation is very, very tight. And so the government, who obviously wants to make some change happen in their term, but it makes it fairly fraught to have some input into that. I'm very, very happy to support this submission. We're all nervous when things are going to change, and there are, as has been reflected by Councillor O'Malley, some potential issues in this body, but giving some proactive direction as to how it might happen, especially we're using the NZTA model, which I think is a very good one to consider. It assists them to assist government in making these changes. I also am cognizant of those issues of planning, and as we ramp up work or not, getting a collective idea in the industry that can deliver that is really key to getting some synergies. I really don't want us to be seeing this necessarily as a funding model first and foremost, though. It is about getting the best delivery and not necessarily seeing it as a way of getting extra funding, because I'm not saying that that model is necessarily broken. It may be loans, but I'm more about getting the quality and the independent thinking about where you might provide infrastructure, and that cannot be politically altered or changed as well. So I'm pretty keen to see. I don't have the same fear, should I say, of a infrastructure ministry assisting with good planning, because certainly being required under the and going to be relied on for matters that we've already heard about today with the housing development and infrastructure being required there. So very happy to support.
The speakers. Okay, look, I see on the one hand, particularly from what Mr Drew has told us, that there's a definite need and definite potential advantages in this kind of board, especially given the workforce, or the ramping up, as he said, of infrastructure projects in this area in the next few years. On the other hand, I hear loud and clear the risks, and they're being played out, not just in infrastructure, they're being played out on water. The Urban Development Authority is, to some extent, a centralising mechanism. So there are dangers with any government that they will take over at the top, at the centre, and impose on them. And given that this decision to create an infrastructure council or board had already been made, that made it all the more important that we put our spoke in and say what we thought, because the government has already, through Minister Jones, has already said this is happening. And had we not expressed an opinion, we would have just been told later on, well, why didn't you say something when you had those concerns? So I support this. I think there's a long way down this track to go, and I think that we're going to need to seek to get the best benefit from this when it is finally set up, at the same time as watching that those risks don't flower and you know, cost us. Councillor Hawkins.
Yeah, thank you, Your Worship. Just briefly, I shared the bemusement, I guess, that many did when this came out for consultation, however brief that consultation was, and that it sort of presented itself as a solution looking for a problem. It wasn't clear from the outset what was trying to be solved here, but I don't think that we should, that it couldn't serve a useful purpose. And if Minister Jones has taught us nothing from his other flagship project, the Provincial Growth Fund, it's that he's more than happy for that to evolve in its scope and purpose and criteria over time, depending on which way the winds may be buffeting him at any particular point. So I relish both this and any subsequent opportunity for us to steer that in the right direction. Because I think there are two concerns here. One is aside from funding, but that is certainly one. One is maintaining local control over decision making and local control over our core infrastructural assets. And two, and drinking water standards has been raised. And second, the quite legitimate funding challenges that local government faces, and not always because councils have chosen to defer investment, but particularly around the drinking water stuff, there are plenty of smaller councils for whom bringing a number of smaller schemes up to a standard is beyond their financial capacity or the politically palatable financial capacity of their local authority. And as has been mentioned, and certainly in this area and many other low-lying communities, the challenges around climate change adaptation will require coordinated support and investment from central government. But my fear really beyond centralisation of funding decisions is that the legitimate resourcing challenges that local government face and needs to be addressed really are used as are weaponised in a way to remove local control and local decision making over core council assets. And I think that's the thing that we need to keep the closest eye on and offer the strongest resistance to. Thanks.
Councillor Elder, do you right of reply?
Well, I'd just like to shadow those concerns, and that is that local governments still have a voice. And that voice is heard. And I think there's lots of benefits in not having silos. There's lots of benefits in working together, and there's lots of benefits in sharing expertise. But the voice of the local government needs to be in there too, and especially when it comes to allocation of resource. So that I reflect Jim O'Malley and Aaron here in saying that. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to put it. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against? No. Recorded Councillor Vandervis. Against. Thank you. It's carried. Now I will move. Thank you, Mr. Drew. Thank you, Ms. Arno. I will move from the chair that the meeting move into non-public for the reasons outlined in the agenda, with the exception of allowing to remain Mr. McFarlane of Becker. Seconded, Councillor Staines. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against? Carried.